New York, 1957. Albert Anastasia sits for a haircut, and the most feared boss in America is suddenly alone. 2 minutes of routine, a lifetime of protection gone. The mystery isn't what happens next. It's who decided the door should stay open. New York City, 1957. The war isn't in the streets anymore. It's in schedules, phone calls, union offices, and quiet nods across restaurant tables. The kind of war where the gunshot is only the final punctuation mark, because the real killing happens earlier, when someone decides you will be left unprotected. Albert Anastasia had survived the loud era. He'd survived Prohibition's chaos, the internal purges, the federal heat, and the shifting alliances that ate lesser men alive. He had a reputation that did more than intimidate. It structured behavior. People didn't just fear Anastasia, they calculated around him, and that's why what happened to him in 1957 was not just an execution, it was a verdict. In the public record, you'll often hear the same simple summary. Anastasia was murdered in a Manhattan barbershop. 2 men walked in. Shots were fired. The Lord High Executioner, the old-school enforcer turned boss, was finally caught in a moment of vulnerability. But that summary hides the only part that actually matters in a power story. Vulnerability is rarely an accident at that level. Men like Anastasia don't simply get caught, they get isolated. Because an underworld assassination in the middle of a hotel barbershop isn't a test of marksmanship. It's a test of control. Control over information, control over access, control over the people paid to be present, and control over the small routines that keep a boss alive. So part 1 is about defining the real problem, not who pulled the trigger. That question is almost too easy, and it's not the one that changes the rules. The real question is who gave the yes before he could stand. To understand why this was a betrayal and a message at the same time, you have to understand what Anastasia represented in 1957 and why certain men no longer wanted that representation alive. Anastasia came up through a world where violence wasn't a tactic, it was a language. He built influence through the docks, through unions, through fear, and through the reputation of being the kind of boss who didn't need committees to act. He was linked by law enforcement, by informants, by Underworld rumor, to Murder Inc., the enforcement arm that made contracts feel like destiny in the 1930s and 40s. Even if the mythology got exaggerated over time, the core point remained. Anastasia's name was associated with the idea that punishment could arrive fast, personal, and absolute. That image used to be an advantage. By the mid-1950s, it was becoming a liability, because the Mafia in America was changing shape. Not morally, structurally. The smartest players weren't trying to look fearless. They were trying to look invisible. They wanted boards, not brawls. Investments, not vendettas. They wanted a system where murder was an administrative decision, not a reflex. And Anastasia, with his temper and his history, didn't always fit the new model. At the same time, the state was learning. The federal government was applying pressure in ways the old generation hadn't faced. Wiretaps, surveillance, grand juries, tax cases, immigration pressure, tools designed not to win a street fight, but to slowly drain the organization. Every public scandal increased the cost of doing business. Now put that against the calendar of 1957. This is the year that feels like a hinge in organized crime history. Law enforcement attention is sharpening. Ambitious bosses are repositioning. Old alliances are being renegotiated. There's a new appetite for cleaner leadership. Men who can sit in a room and sound like legitimate executives, even if their hands are just as dirty. In that environment, a boss like Anastasia isn't simply dangerous because of what he might do. He's dangerous because of what he might cause. He could start a war at the wrong time. He could draw attention at the wrong moment. He could refuse a compromise that everyone else has already silently accepted. He could be the kind of leader who forces the system to reveal itself, and a hidden system survives by never being forced. So when Anastasia dies, you shouldn't picture it as 2 gunmen hunting a man. You should picture it as a network deciding it is done protecting him. Because protection at that level isn't just a pair of armed men nearby. Protection is phone calls that never get answered. It's doors that stay locked. It's favors that still get paid. It's warnings that reach you in time. It's the difference between a hallway full of witnesses and a hallway that feels strangely empty. And on the morning Anastasia went for a haircut, something about the protective network failed or was instructed to fail. That barbershop was not some random storefront. It was inside the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, a place with foot traffic, staff, routines and eyes, a public setting. And paradoxically, that's what made it so effective as a message. If you can be reached there, you can be reached anywhere. If you can be hit while seated, half-covered, mid-routine, then the underworld isn't just saying we can kill you, it's saying we can decide when you are alone, and that is the deeper terror, not the weapon, the abandonment. So let's break down the problem like a case file. First, access. How do killers enter a hotel barbershop and reach a major boss at close range? That doesn't happen by luck. It happens when no one stops them, and no one feels empowered to stop them, which immediately raises a question. Were the killers disguised, expected, waved through, or simply operating in a space where everyone had learned to look away? Second, timing. A boss's routine is not a public schedule. Even a haircut can be a controlled appointment, often used as a safe window because it's predictable and managed. If someone knows the exact moment a boss will be sitting still, that knowledge comes from proximity, staff, drivers, bodyguards, associates, or someone who hears it from someone else and passes it along. Third, the missing shield. The famous detail in this story is not the chair, it's the gap around the chair. Where were the men whose job was to make sure nothing like this could happen? Were they delayed, distracted, told to wait outside? Were they the wrong men, loyal to the wrong future? In Mafia history, the most important betrayals aren't dramatic, they're procedural. They look like small failures until you add them up. A driver takes a longer route. A bodyguard steps away for a phone call. A doorman doesn't challenge two men walking too confidently. A friend says, "You'll be fine, it's just a haircut." A warning never arrives. Each act is minor. Together, they form a corridor. And the final problem, bigger than all the others, is authorization. Because in a world governed by retaliation, killing a boss is not just homicide, it's policy. It requires permission, or it triggers a chain reaction that can tear apart entire crews, rackets and alliances. A boss's death can spark a war that costs everyone money. So if Anastasia was killed without permission, the organization would have burned afterward. But if he was killed with permission, spoken or unspoken, then the lack of war becomes part of the evidence. That's why the title of this story isn't really about a chair. The chair is theater. The chair is the stage where the decision becomes visible. The real story is the yes. The yes might not have been a literal vote in one smoky room, recorded like minutes. It could have been a series of approvals, silence from men who normally would object, neutrality from allies who normally would mobilize, and quiet cooperation from people who controlled the doors. And in 1957, there were men with motives to want that yes. There were rivals who benefited from a power vacuum. There were partners who wanted a calmer, more businesslike boss in that seat. There were ambitious figures who understood that as long as Anastasia lived, certain deals couldn't be finalized because he was unpredictable, and unpredictability is poison to long-term profit. So the problem we're defining in part 1 is simple to say and hard to answer. How does a man with Anastasia's reputation end up alone at the exact moment someone comes to collect him? Because once you accept that he didn't just get caught, the story shifts. It stops being a true crime whodunit and becomes what it really is, a lesson in how power changes hands. In part 2, we're going to rewind through the pressure building around Anastasia, his alliances, his enemies, and the internal logic that made removing him not just possible but profitable. And then we'll trace the most important thread of all, the information trail that turned a normal morning routine into a perfectly timed verdict. What matters now is the pressure that built up around him, because assassinations like this don't begin with gunmen, they begin with incentives. By 1957, Albert Anastasia was not just a boss, he was a problem that different factions defined in different ways. To some he was the last hard piece on a board that needed to be rearranged. To others, he was a warning sign, too much heat, too much temperament, too much history attached to one name. And unlike the street era, where killing a rival could be improvised, the 1950s underworld required something else, permission that looked like inevitability. So let's map the forces around Anastasia without pretending the record is perfectly clean. Some pieces are documented, others live in informant statements, investigative theories, and patterns that make sense only when you understand how these organizations protect themselves. First, the leadership landscape. Anastasia headed what many at the time still called the Mangano family, a lineage of power that ran from Vincent Mangano to Anastasia, and then after 1957 into a new era. But he didn't rule in a vacuum. He was part of a larger system, the Commission, the interfamily mechanism designed to prevent wars and regulate major decisions. That system had its own logic. Stability beats pride, and money beats sentiment. Anastasia, by temperament, was not always a stability-first man. The second force, ambition. You can't understand 1957 without understanding how ambition behaves in a regulated criminal system. The Commission model didn't erase ambition, it disciplined it. Instead of open warfare, you got quiet coalition building. Instead of public threats, you got private promises. Instead of "I'll take your territory," you got "we can solve this problem together." If Anastasia's removal benefited multiple parties, then the yes didn't need to be shouted. It could be exchanged like a business nod. You don't ask too many questions, and you don't demand receipts. The third force, alliances and liabilities. Anastasia's power ran through the waterfront, labor, docks, trucking, the places where legitimate commerce touches the underworld. Those rackets require political tolerance, union leverage, and a low profile. Every time a boss becomes a headline, the price of those rackets goes up. Officials start making calls, newspapers start sniffing, prosecutors start looking for a symbol they can put on the front page. Anastasia was a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. So imagine the conversations happening around him in 1956, 1957. Not dramatic movie scenes, quiet arithmetic. Can he be controlled? Will he retaliate if we move pieces under him? Is he stable enough to keep the waterfront calm? If the government tightens the screws, will he panic and do something loud? And if he does, who pays for it? Then you get to the question that sits at the center of every internal mafia decision: succession. Because when a boss is removed, the real fight is not over the body, it's over the chair he leaves behind. Who inherits the income streams? Who controls appointments? Who decides which crews get protected and which crews get squeezed? In that context, Anastasia's death wasn't just an end, it was a transfer. Now, there are names that inevitably appear in the historical discussion of this period, men whose ambitions and alliances shaped the late 1950s. Depending on the source, you'll see different emphases. Defendigators and later accounts often frame Anastasia's murder as aligned with a larger reshuffling involving powerful figures in the national hierarchy, including Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino. The important point for our story isn't to pretend we can read a single secret meeting like a script. The important point is structural. Anastasia's removal fit too cleanly into the interests of rising, calmer, more system-minded leadership to be treated as random. Because here's the key. In organized crime, you can tell a lot by what does not happen afterward. If the killing of a boss was truly unauthorized, the response would have been chaotic. Crews would start moving. Retaliation would be expected. Everyone would be on edge because the rules had been broken. But after Anastasia's murder, the system didn't collapse into open warfare. It absorbed the event. The machine kept running. That doesn't prove a formal commission vote was recorded like minutes in a file, but it strongly suggests that the yes, the permission, the acceptance was already in place, at least among the people who mattered. So how do you get to a yes on a man like Anastasia? You do it by reframing him. You don't say he's too strong, that makes you look weak. You don't say I want what he has, that makes you look greedy. You say he's bad for business, he's drawing heat, he's unpredictable. In other words, you turn murder into management, and once you turn it into management, you can recruit allies who would never join a personal vendetta, but will absolutely join a necessary correction. That's the betrayal side of this story, the decision to treat a living person as a risk factor. Now the message side. A message killing is not just about who dies, it's about where, how, and what it tells every other person watching. The location, Midtown Manhattan, a hotel barbershop, was not a hidden alley. It was a semi-public space where the victim would be seated, exposed, and unable to immediately respond. A boss getting hit at a social club or a street corner can look like a feud. A boss getting hit while grooming, while doing something normal, signals something colder. You're not being hunted, you're being scheduled. And that kind of message only lands if other power players do not immediately challenge it. Which brings us back to the most operational question in the case, the protection gap. Anastasia was not a man who walked alone in a naive way. Even if he didn't always move with a visible army, he had drivers, associates, and a network. So the day he sat down for that haircut, the killers didn't just need courage, they needed clearance, social clearance, not a written pass, the kind of clearance that comes from confidence, the sense that no one present will intervene because intervention would put them on the wrong side of the future. That's why internal information is the most valuable weapon in a hit like this. If someone inside your circle can confirm your timing and routine, the killers don't need to stalk you for weeks. They just need to show up once, at the one moment you're fixed in place. And the betrayal doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be as simple as a leak that looks harmless. He'll be at the hotel in the morning. He's getting a trim upstairs. Yeah, he's there today. Once that information leaves the safe circle, everything else becomes logistics. Another uncomfortable point. Even loyal guards can become ineffective if they're given the wrong instructions. Wait in the lobby. Don't make a scene. He's just getting a haircut. Relax. Those orders can come from habit, from arrogance, or from manipulation. The end result is the same. The boss is separated from the people who would create friction. And friction is what stops an assassination. Friction is a bodyguard questioning strangers. Friction is a staff member refusing access. Friction is someone deciding the risk is not worth it. Remove the friction, and the hit becomes simple. So by the time Anastasia sat down, the most important decision had already been made somewhere else. Not kill him, but don't save him. And that distinction matters, because in a tightly controlled power structure, actively killing a boss is dangerous, but allowing him to be killed can be shared. Shared blame is safer than personal blame. If everyone plays a small role, one man looks away, another stays neutral, another provides timing, another offers protection afterward, then no single person carries the full weight of the act. The system distributes guilt the same way it distributes profit. That's how you get a yes that doesn't sound like one. In part 3, we'll step into the day itself, the final chain of small permissions, the choreography of isolation, and what happened after the shots that truly reveals the meaning of the murder, who moved into the vacuum, who stayed strangely calm, and how the Underworld understood the message without anyone needing to announce it out loud. So let's walk into the final day, not as a sensational scene, but as the last mile of a decision already made. Morning in Manhattan doesn't feel like danger. It feels like routine. Cars idling, elevators moving, men in suits acting like they're late for meetings. That's exactly why the Park Sheraton setting worked. It allowed the killers to blend into the most common disguise in America, being ordinary. Anastasia came to the hotel barbershop as if the city still followed the old rule. If your name is heavy enough, the world adjusts around you. He sat down expecting the invisible system to hold. Not because he was careless, but because this is what power does to people over time. It turns caution into assumption, and assumption is the doorway betrayal walks through. The barbershop itself was a controlled environment, a waiting area, chairs, mirrors, the kind of place where everyone is partially distracted, eyes on reflections, hands busy, attention split. It is not a battlefield, that's why it becomes one. The reported mechanics of the murder are brutal in their simplicity. 2 men entered, moved directly toward Anastasia, and opened fire at close range. Anastasia reacted. There are accounts that he tried to rise, that he lurched forward, that he fought the chair itself for a second. In some versions, the mirror becomes part of the chaos, shattering the scene into fragments. But the physical struggle is not the core of the story. The core is that the killers got that close. That's the proof of the yes. Because even a reckless hitman understands the difference between a target who is isolated and a target who is protected. You can feel it the moment you enter a room. You can see it in posture, in exits, in the presence of men who aren't customers and aren't staff. That morning, the room did not feel protected enough to stop what was coming, and once the shots were fired, the message was already in motion, not just to Anastasia's men, but to every ambitious figure watching. The rules were being enforced. A boss could be removed in a public, humiliating way, and the sky would not fall. Now we move to what happened next, because the aftermath is where power shows its true face. In a normal world, a high-profile killing triggers chaos, panic, retaliation, emotional decisions. In the Mafia world, a boss being murdered triggers a test: who stays calm and who looks like they already knew. After Anastasia's death, there was no prolonged open war that tore the organization apart. There were no months of uncontrollable bloodletting that made the papers every day. Instead, the structure absorbed the shock, and a new reality settled in quickly. That's how you know this wasn't simply a trigger pull, because who killed him is a question the police ask. Who replaced him without a fight is the question the underworld asks. And the replacement, rapid, clean, businesslike, tells you what kind of murder this was. It wasn't a street feud. It was an internal correction with external coordination. The kind of correction that requires not just shooters, but agreement from enough corners to prevent retaliation from becoming policy. That agreement is the real betrayal. Not a single Judas moment, but a coalition of self-interest. People often imagine betrayal as emotional, a friend turning on you, a trusted man selling you out for money. That happens, but at the top level, betrayal is usually colder. It's colleagues deciding you are no longer worth the risk of keeping alive. It's them deciding that the organization's future is easier without your personality in it. And if you want to understand why Anastasia could be left alone at the wrong moment, consider the psychological side of power transfer. When a boss is alive, everyone has to perform loyalty. They have to attend his events, show respect, act like they fear him, act like they would die for him. But once the decision is made that he's going to be removed, loyalty becomes dangerous. Not for moral reasons, for survival reasons. Because anyone seen as too loyal becomes a potential problem in the next era. The new leadership will remember who mourned too loudly. So what happens in the days after a hit like this is a quiet rewrite of relationships. Men who used to stand close step back. Phone calls change tone. Old favors stop getting returned. New meetings happen without old faces in the room. This is how a regime changes without a public announcement. Anastasia's murder sent two messages at the same time, and that dual message is what makes it historically important. Message 1, to every boss who still believed fear alone could protect them. Fear is not armor if the people around you stop fearing you more than they fear the future without you. Anastasia had made men afraid for decades, but fear doesn't create loyalty, it creates patience. People wait until they can remove you safely. Message 2, to every ambitious strategist watching the system evolve. You don't need to outshoot the old guard. You need to out-organize them. You need information, timing and permission. You need a structure that makes violence look like an administrative decision rather than a personal outburst. That is the real turning point element of this story. Anastasia's death sits in the era where the Mafia increasingly tried to behave like a corporation. Not less violent, just more strategic about when and how violence was used. And the most revealing part of all is that the killing happened in a place designed for comfort. A chair, a cape, a mirror, the opposite of a battlefield. It reduced the victim from a feared boss to a human being caught mid-routine. That humiliation is not incidental, it's part of the communication. Because the underworld doesn't just remove leaders, it makes examples. Anastasia's legend had been built on intimidation, on the idea that he was the man who could order death with a look, that he was too dangerous to confront head-on. Killing him in a barbershop flips that legend into its opposite. You are not untouchable, you are reachable. And once that lesson is taught, everyone recalibrates. Not just about Anastasia, but about themselves. They start asking the question that keeps empires alive and friendships hollow. If it happened to him, what protects me? This is why the story belongs in the channel's core niche, decision and consequence. The decision was not made in the barbershop. The decision was made earlier, in a sequence of approvals, silences, and calculated neutrality. The consequence wasn't only Anastasia's death, it was the normalization of a new kind of power, power that doesn't roar, power that manages, power that can remove a man without triggering a war because the yes has already been distributed. And if you're looking for the lesson in one sentence, it's this. In organized crime, the most dangerous moment isn't when your enemies hate you, it's when your allies stop needing you. Anastasia sat down thinking he was entering a routine, but he was actually entering the final proof of his isolation. The chair didn't kill him. The chair only held him still long enough for the decision already made elsewhere to arrive. And the final betrayal wasn't the bullets, it was the empty space around him. In the next story, we'll follow what this kind of silent yes leads to, how a single power vacuum reshapes alliances, how public events can expose private systems, and how one meeting can turn organized crime into a visible national problem overnight.